we're videotaping our presentations, and it's my camera and she doesn't completely know how to work it, so I'm trying to give her a little cues. Sorry. And one of the reasons that I mentioned that we're videotaping these presentations is my project is actually a sort of multi-genre project in an interesting way. It exists also as a blog, as a series of blog posts that I've developed because I'm doing a project with my first-year composition students where they're doing research blogs. So if you're interested in a different approach to this same subject matter, you could go to visitinggrandmother.blogspot.com. Visitinggrandmother.blogspot.com for those of you who are writing that down. So here it is. Visiting Grandmother, a question about the ethics of the friendly teaching persona. In the past few years, I've gone through 2 graduate teaching assistant training seminars and semester-long pedagogy courses. One at the University of Vermont in the fall of 2009, and the other 2 years later at West Virginia University. It was especially interesting for me to go through the training at WVU because I had 2 years of teaching experience, while roughly 2/3 of my coworkers had never been in front of a class before. I was fascinated by some of the questions my new colleagues asked during our 2-week-long training seminar in August, and they were questions I'm sure that I had asked 2 years earlier. Questions about how to lead group discussions, how to structure effective peer review, how to respond fairly and productively to student writing. But the question that launched this paper was, how do I establish my authority in the classroom? This is a serious question, especially for new GTAs. Many of us are only a few years older than the students we are instructing, and a good portion of us recently finished our own undergrad degrees. We often don't feel like we really belong in front of a classroom. And because we don't feel like real instructors, there's a very real fear that our students won't see us as real instructors. And this is something that most of us want to know how to deal with before we set foot in our classrooms on the first day of the semester. The motto, or injunction, I'm not really sure what it is, that I heard in both training seminars is to be friendly, but not friends with our students. In some ways this sounds like very direct, even folksy wisdom, but I feel there are unresolved tensions within the mantra that need further exploration. And I want to say early on that my thinking about authority, particularly teaching authority, has been informed by the Lacanian philosopher Slavoj Žižek. In an interview for the talk show Nightbeat, Žižek explained his theory of authority using the examples of the good old-fashioned totalitarian father and the so-called tolerant postmodern father. The totalitarian father commands his child to visit grandmother's house and behave in an appropriate way. In this scenario, as Žižek claims, that's good, you can resist, nothing is broken. On the other hand, the postmodern father will say to the child, you should only visit grandmother if you really want to, but, and this is one of those really significant buts, you know how much your grandmother loves seeing you. Žižek says that every child who is not an idiot, and they are not idiots, knows that this apparent free choice secretly contains an even stronger order. It's not only do you have to visit your grandmother, but you have to like it. In other words, the rhetoric of the choice is actually a more totalitarian imposition of authority on the child. With the first father, the crime is not going to grandmother's house. With the second, the crime is not wanting to go. My concern is that as instructors, we avoid the pitfall of presenting choice while using that rhetoric to hide an even more powerful use of authority. Leanne Carroll sums up this concern about the power of language to hide or reveal authority in the classroom, writing, that we are all operating in good faith is a story that most of my students and I struggle to tell ourselves. Now, to try and make this concern a little clearer, I'm going to first turn to Žižek's book, The Puppet and the Dwarf, which he discussed in the Nightbeat interview. When we adopt a friendly but not friends teaching persona, do we conceptualize our students as what Žižek termed the subject supposed not to know? One example Zizek gives of this subject supposed not to know is little children who are supposed not to know the facts of life, but whose blessed ignorance we, knowing adults, are supposed to protect. Anyone who's read any of Zizek's various comments on children will know that he believes that children are not ignorant of the facts of life, and that this ideal of innocence is imposed upon them because it comforts adults to think of children as pure. But in the cases of our students, I wonder if a friendly teaching persona is not sometimes a smokescreen to try and obscure our institutional roles as graders, evaluators, and enforcers of policies. Have we as instructors really empowered our students by downplaying our institutional responsibilities? Or is it merely a pose that allows us to think that our students feel empowered? This is the crucial point here. Every comp-red instructor, GTA trainer, and so on that I've talked to has wanted to empower their students as thinkers, writers, readers, human beings, members of the community, and so on. But to what extent can we empower our students within an institutional framework that demands evaluation? One of the most intelligent and interesting professors I had as an undergrad commented on this issue of empowerment when I posted the abstract for this paper on my blog. Michael Austin, now a provost at Newman University in Kansas, writes, "I have always struggled with how to empower students without, at the same time, merely disguising the very real power that a professor exercises." And the way he conceptualizes that balance is based on a desire to deal honestly with students. Austin explains, "I have also come to the conclusion, consciously, that it is unethical to try to mask the power dynamics of a classroom. As long as I sign off on the grades, I have the power. The rhetorician in me believes that my primary ethical responsibility to the students is to fairly represent the actual rhetorical situation that they are in." I think what separates Austin's comment from much theorization on empowering our students is that he doesn't want to mask the power dynamics of a classroom, while much pedagogical theory focuses on changing the power dynamics of a classroom. In essence, this is the precise question I'm trying to work around here. Does a friendly teaching persona substantively change the power relations of a classroom, or does it merely hide an instructor's continued use of power? In order to answer that question, I think we must establish what we mean by a friendly teaching persona. I'm drawn to the complex and critical explanation of friendship Marshall Gregory gives in his essay, Curriculum, Pedagogy, and Teacherly Ethos. Gregory cites Aristotle's definition of friendship found in the Rhetoric, the feeling toward anyone as wishing for him what you believe to be good things, not for your own sake, but for his, and being inclined, as far as you can, to bring these things about. This type of friendship, Gregory points out, is very different than the modern idea that friends are merely, in both senses of that word, supportive of one another, even when a friend makes an ethically or logically bad decision. Initially, as a new GTA, I thought of friendship in terms of this supportive and affable rapport. Gregory writes that Aristotelian friends help us improve ourselves, not for their own satisfaction, but for our own good. And it is in this sense that composition instructors can be true friends to our students. Gregory proposes constructing a teaching ethos based on a constructive but critical feedback on writing with the intention of helping students. To Gregory, this is the most productive mode of friendship. He puts it, "The kind of teacherly befriending I'm talking about entails creating an atmosphere of classroom trust in which the teacher's willingness to call a bad job is seen by the student as helpful and productive rather than mean and destructive." Sorry. This sounds like an excellent strategy and a good model for friendship. However, in practice, creating such an atmosphere is rarely easy for a teacher, particularly for a teacher without a backlog of instructional experience to draw from. As Kathy Overholse-Smith, and I apologize if I said her middle name wrong, I'm not completely sure how it's pronounced, writes, Gregory advocates that we practice a variety of methods, but he more or less leaves it at that. As a result, his admonition to be, say, tolerant, as much as I agree with him, does not show us the way. When new teachers are about to step into the classroom, they probably rarely ask themselves, should my ethos be helpful and productive? Most are more likely to ask, how can I make my ethos helpful and productive? And what's rather unfair, in that juvenile way of claiming that things are unfair, is that there really is no particular way to make one's ethos helpful and productive. It is a skill that we are all continually learning to do better. This statement, however, is poor comfort to a 22-year-old about to take attendance for the first time. And that young GTA is quite likely to feel pulled between different responsibilities, impulses, and theories of teaching that they've probably learned in only the vaguest way during a 1 to 2 week summer seminar. In fact, this is a fundamental tension within teaching that Peter Elbow identified in Embracing Contraries in the Teaching Process. Elbow describes a tension between our desire to nurture and aid our students and a desire to maintain fidelity to the disciplines we have chosen to pursue as careers. He writes that on the one hand, our loyalty to students asks us to be their allies and hosts as we instruct and share, to invite all students to enter in and join us as members of a learning community, even if they have difficulty. But we are simultaneously drawn in the opposite direction, toward exclusivity. Elbow explains, our commitment to knowledge and society asks us to be guardians or bouncers. We must discriminate, evaluate, test, grade, certify. In other words, we simultaneously want to assist our students as much as we can and to maintain the integrity of our disciplines by passing only the best qualified student scholars. Elbow argues that this tension is inherent to teaching, and especially to teaching composition. The basic thrust of Embracing Contraries in the Teaching Process is that we should use these bipolar impulses to construct a fair and productive teaching methodology. In his description of the course layout, Elbow writes that he begins the semester and each individual writing project in his guardian role. He provides strict guidelines and detailed explanations of his evaluative criteria. But then, during the course of the semester or project, he adopts the role of an ally. Elbow writes that his ethos tells his students, I'll be a kind of lawyer for the defense, helping you bring out your best in your battles with the other me, the prosecuting attorney me, when he emerges at the end. This is much closer to a pedagogical method than what we find in Gregory's article, but Elbow still presents ethos as something that an instructor already knows how to build. The problem is that many first-time instructors, and even those of us who have taught for only a few years, do not necessarily have a good sense of how to present an effective, helpful, and friendly ethos on a day-to-day basis. Often we will think back to how favorite teachers have taught in the classes we've taken, and we try to draw inspiration from these models. In a postmodernist exploration of teaching composition, Leanne Carroll describes a shift in the way in how teaching identity is conceptualized, from a stable identity emerging from within to a position she describes as much more constructed by culture and language, bits and pieces pulled together provisionally to act in unexpected ways. But remembering veteran teachers, especially those who are good enough at their trade to make a lasting impression, is very different than knowing the complex processes through which those teaching personae came to be. In cultural depictions of successful teachers, like the movies Dead Poets Society or Freedom Writers, for instance, rarely provide useful models for practical application. Instead, as with almost everything else, the best practical instructor is teaching experience. And my own teaching persona has evolved in a number of ways over my short 2 years, now 3 years, 2 years when I wrote this paper, of teaching. And I hope that my practice now is better than it was my first semester. When I began teaching at the University of Vermont in the fall of 2009, I intended my teaching persona to be very loose and anti-authoritarian. And to a degree, I still am. But at that time, I was much closer to being friends, as opposed to friendly, with my students. I was 22 years old and still saw myself much more as a peer than as an instructor, so I did not believe that I should enforce much discipline. Luckily, that semester I had a class without many problems, but when I did begin to have problematic students, poor attendance, work not done on time, disruptive in class, and so on, I was ill-prepared to really deal with them. The main tool I felt was at my disposal for disciplining students was threatening a C or a D grade, because I had dedicated myself to not failing anyone. that quickly went by the wayside, by the way. And it took me a couple of semesters to realize that many students that are inclined to put in minimal effort are frequently content to pass a general studies course with a C. One of the main things that helped me evolve as a teacher was the move to West Virginia University when I began my doctoral program. Now don't misunderstand me, I really enjoyed the first-year composition program at UVM, but the policies were left very open for individual GTAs to decide upon, rather than mandated university guidelines. For instance, I didn't have an attendance policy for the 4 semesters that I taught there, and that made it somewhat difficult to punish people who had missed large numbers of classes. I found myself shaving points from their participation grades or their portfolio grades, both of which were justified due to missed classwork and not contributing to class discussions on the days that they weren't there. But in hindsight, this informal method of enforcing attendance was not particularly effective because students hadn't been directly told that attendance would be a major factor in their grades. This, I think, is a good example of the way a friendly teaching persona obscured my actual exercise of power required by the institution. At WVU, on the other hand, the English department has mandated policies for attendance, late work, tardiness, and so on. While I don't always agree with these policies, I appreciate that the department wanted us to adopt these policies for at least our first semester of teaching. If left to my own devices, I probably never would have adopted a policy failing students after a certain number of absences from class. And obviously the point that I'm trying to make is not that we should all have strict attendance policies, but that experimenting with greater and lesser levels of authority and directness can help us move toward constructing a teaching ethos that is friendly, but also honest about our institutionally required exercise of power. And when my co-presenter, Jessie, peer-reviewed this paper, she pointed out that at the end, I fell into the same trap that Kathy Smith critiques in Marshall Gregory's essay. I provide a general goal rather than a specific answer to the question that I've posed throughout this paper. And my own experience does not answer whether or not there is a way to genuinely empower students without simply hiding a more devious exercise of power. In all honesty, I do not have an answer to the question, and I'm not sure that there is one. As unsatisfying as it is, the only conclusion I can come to is that there are too many variants between individual teaching personae and the actual day-to-day performances of teachers to make any kind of broad generalizations. Instead of posing an answer to the question, my goal with this paper is to prompt discussion and self-reflection on the actual effects of the pedagogical theories and strategies we as GTAs are trained to use, which will shape the rest of our careers as teachers and student